Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to this session. Thanks so much for joining us today on the first of our series of ALBA-IBRO workshops from declaration to action. So these workshops are supported by IBRO, by the International Brain Research Organization, which is the global association of neuroscience societies that aims to promote and support neuroscience around the world. IBRO, apart from supporting ALBA and the series of workshops, provides support for training, education, research, outreach, and engagement activities, and supports the community also through the publication of two journals, Neuroscience and the IBRO Neuroscience Reports. And in fact proceeds from the two journals, so I'm trying to click on things here, proceeds from the two journals support over 70% actually of IBRO initiatives. So by publishing in those journals, you're contributing to IBRO initiatives. And you can learn more about the opportunities for people at all career stages from the IBRO website by looking at that QR code. Now, the ALBA network was created to promote equity and diversity in neuroscience and the brain sciences, and has more than 2,000 members now from 95 countries and keeps on growing every day. And our goals are to recognize implicit bias and discrimination, and to give better visibility and help to provide professional development opportunities to scientists from underrepresented groups. And we are very keen for people to get involved and or support the cause in any way. It's completely free to become an ALBA member, and you're very welcome to sign up if you haven't done so already. And in particular, what we're calling today's workshop is the declaration workshop. And what we mean by this is that it relates to the ALBA declaration, which is one of the central pillars of ALBA. The declaration is really a resource. It's not just a declaration of principles, it's a resource for finding information about concrete and positive and evidence-based actions that people can take to promote equity and inclusivity in neuroscience. Oh, I seem to be out of video, sorry. I hadn't noticed. Thanks, Mathilde. So we, and when I say we, I mean the people who have been leading ALBA since the outset, including Laura, who's here, and Megan Carey and Carmen Tandy, thought of ways in which the declaration could be useful, could be used, and in which it could guide the availability of resources for people to make progress towards. The way to do that is exemplified here. So if you go on the website, and you find the ALBA Declaration on Equity and Inclusion, you can click on those specific points there and find a lot more information, not just around what we mean by each of those points, but also in terms of finding resources to links of information and data. So, for example, if we look at the section on raising awareness of bias and exploring training on unconscious bias, there's a whole range of resources that you can look at, and our aim is to update them as much as possible and to continue to provide useful information both for individuals and organizations who sign up to the principles. The declaration was launched 4 years ago, and this sort of set of resources was first published in 2022. And as I say, our aim is to continue to update them. And if anyone feels that they have information that would be useful to share with the community, please do get in touch. We are always very happy to get your input. So I think I won't go over everything that's on this slide, but I think the key point here is that for today, we want to concentrate on bias in decision making as one of the drivers of inequity in science and in academia. And with that purpose, we have designed this session. So it's not just about providing unconscious bias training to individuals, it's about thinking how in practice bias affects careers and how perhaps working at organizational level, we can try and make decision-making more robust against bias in decision-making. And to that end, we've invited Camille Morand, who is an entrepreneur and consultant based in France. And we also have Laura, my colleague Laura Andre from King's College London. Camille has a lot of professional experience in supporting diversity in recruiting. She ran a company for a number of years, which sought to do principle-based improvements in how companies recruit, starting from France, but also internationally. And Laura has a huge amount of experience that she will tell us about in part of our session later in discussion with Camille, relevant to the topic of the session. So with that, I will, oh yes, the other thing I wanted to say is that in addition to today's workshop, we have planned for 2 workshops that further develop other aspects of the declaration. And those are planned for September and November. We don't have a complete date yet, but we will announce them as the time gets closer. So with that, I will leave you with Camille. Thanks so much, Camille, for being with us today. And I'd just like to encourage people to tell us what you think of the workshop once it's done using the short survey in the QR code. Thanks so much. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you, ALBA and IBRO, for organizing this workshop. The idea of this workshop is it's going to be participative. So we really encourage you guys to send your questions in the chat, open your mics when you have questions. There's going to be plenty of moments where we will invite you to participate because we think that's how you're going to get the most out of this workshop. We would like this to be as concrete as possible and related to current problems and questions you have in your day-to-day work, in your activities, in your labs, in your institutions. So please feel free to ask questions anytime, to participate in the chat, to open your mics. So I'll share a quick presentation to talk about cognitive biases in recruiting. And then there's going to be some work in like breakout rooms. So let me just first share this. I've prepared a short presentation on decision-making and biases just because I feel like there are lots of things that are said on this and not all of the things that we hear about cognitive biases in recruiting, in my opinion, make sense. So there's a little bit of like technical theoretical work I'm going to present. It's going to be short, and then we're going to do mostly like discussions about concrete problems that you guys may have. So let me put this, I'm navigating between many screens, so sorry for the... All right, so just to give, again, a brief idea of how this workshop is going to go. So Miguel introduced the idea for the workshop. I'm going to give you like a 15 minutes, 20 minutes presentation about cognitive biases. It's going to be interactive. I'm going to ask you guys to participate by answering questions I'm asking about cognitive biases, and then we will discuss what cognitive biases are and what they aren't. So really, please feel free to participate. I can talk for cognitive biases for hours, probably days, and that's not the idea. The idea is I want to address points and questions that you guys may have. After we talk about cognitive biases, we're going to move on for a conversation with Laura about concrete actions that she's worked on that I think will be very relatable to the kind of questions you guys have on a day-to-day basis. And then there will be this breakout rooms work where each of you will have the opportunity to talk about a problem that you would like to solve. And we're going to have about a half hour to try to solve a few specific cases that participants will bring. Okay, so let's start with cognitive biases. So just to explain why I'm talking about this, Miguel gave a brief introduction, so I'm going to be short. I've worked 10 years in cognitive science and neuroscience. My work was on perception, decision-making, and cognitive biases. And from that work, I've moved on and created a company that operated in making recruiting more fair for companies. It was a relatively large startup. We had 60 employees. We raised 10 million euros. We had most of the most important clients in France, including McDonald's, Accenture. So we did work on how to make recruiting more fair with large clients at scale. So the perspective from which I'm talking to you today is both from the theoretical perspective of cognitive biases and decision making, which I'm completely fascinated by, but I'm also talking to you from the concrete perspective of somebody who actually sold a solution to companies to make recruiting more fair. So let's go. I will ask you a few questions to demonstrate cognitive biases. I hope you will find this presentation interesting. Again, feel free to interrupt, ask questions, anything if the idea is to make this participative. So let's go, cognitive biases. I'm gonna ask you a few questions and I would like you guys to answer in the chat. I will try to monitor the chat, but if my co-host can monitor the chat, that would be also lovely. I have it right here. All right, so let's go. So the first question is, I'm asking you, what is the most common pet? I've asked in France, but you probably can apply this to most Occidental countries. So what's the most common pet you think in France or in the UK or in Germany? I can't tell this is true around the globe, so please respond in the chat. So we have B, dog, C, B, 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 B. Okay, thank you. Keep going. You can keep answering. When I do this, usually I record your responses and I run the stats real time to show you, but you can look at the responses and see that you can kind of run the stats yourself. You will see that there's a majority of B, and a little bit of C and a little bit of A, right? You can look for yourself, it's in the chat. So I'll ask you a few questions and we will debrief them later. The second one is this one. So now we're moving on to bias 2. I'm putting it in the chat. So we have 2 candidates for a job, Pierre and David, and we're asking which of the 2 is more creative. Pierre is intelligent, skillful, hardworking, warm, determined, pragmatic, and meticulous. And David is intelligent, skillful, hardworking, determined, pragmatic, meticulous, and cold. So you can respond, yeah, with the name, that's fine. Is Pierre or David more creative? Of course, you know there's a trick, but don't take into account the trick. Try to answer what comes to mind. Yeah, so of course, unable to determine, I know you're smart, I know you know it's a trick, right? This is a demonstration of a bias in a workshop. So of course, you know there's a trick, but if you follow your heart, what would you say? So we have a bunch of answers that have come in, and we can have a look quickly. David, Pierre, 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 David, Pierre, David, Pierre, 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 Pierre. So there's a bunch of Pierre, some people who say we can determine, and a few Davids. Okay, remember that for later. The question, oops. Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry. So, other question. What is your ability to meet deadline? Sorry, I have to put it in the chat so we remember. So what's your ability to meet project deadline? So A, if you're above average, B, if you're average, C, if you're below average. Alors, somebody responds V, which is not an answer. So we have A, B, B, average. So average is B. Somebody says most thing A, that's not exactly true, edits, but we'll talk about that later. A, B, A, C, there's one C, B, C, A, B, A, B, 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 A, B, B, B. Okay, so mostly A, mostly B, and a few C's. Okay, so up. All right, so that was a quick demo. We're gonna debrief them now. Again, you know this is a trick, but it's just a demonstration and also to show how powerful they are, because even though we know it's a trick, it works. Okay, so which one's more creative? In general, and this is what happened today, people respond Pierre. I've run this, now it's been 10 years I'm running this question with rooms that are from 10 people to 500 people. See, I always have, sometimes I get more David, but it's super rare. Most of the time people respond Pierre. Pierre is more creative. Okay, so why do we intuitively say that Pierre is more creative? As you probably saw, the only difference between the two is, that Pierre is warm and David is cold. If you look at all the description, I'm sorry, I usually put in bold so intelligence the same, skillful, hardworking, etc. Right? They're all the same. The only difference is warm or cold. So why being warm would influence you automatically to think that Pierre is more creative? It's because of the halo effect. So the halo effect is the fact that we tend to attribute when there is a positive effect, when someone or something is portrayed as positive by a specific feature, that positive feature will spill out to other features that are unrelated. Okay, so I'm stressing, it's very important to understand positive, because in our cultures in general, being warm is considered as positive and being cold is considered as not that positive, and being creative is considered as positive and being non-creative is considered as negative. So the halo effect is this kind of like spilling over thing where we say that somebody's warm, so now we think they're creative. Statistically, there is no relevance, right? Like creative people are not more or less cold. There's actually studies on that. Okay, so that's called the halo effect. The impact of this effect in D&I is obviously when you have somebody who presents themselves with confidence, and most people will, again, it's automatic, right? You will automatically have the impression that that person is more competent. There's also that effect in the corporate world that probably also in academia, when the person went to the same school as the recruiter, they're going to get like an extra bonus point for this. And also it's been proven that people who are attractive and tall get much more money than people who are not attractive and short. Okay, so that was for the halo effect. Yeah, there's also that thing that these studies that prove that if you're overweight, people will consider that you're lazy and incompetent. Okay, so there's millions of examples of that. I don't think I need to drill on this. The question about the pet. So as you saw, we've had most responses were B, and we had a few C and a few A, right? So we have kind of a normal distribution here that is centered around the dog. Of course, the answer is not the dog, it's the fish. And not only are there more fish than dogs, but there's 5 times more fish than dogs. So it's huge. So if our ability collectively to represent the world was close to reality, we should have said the fish. If we were a little bit biased, maybe some of us would have said the dog. But that's not what's happening. We're like heavily biased towards the dog, right? So here the bias is the availability bias that probably you guys have heard of or know. So the availability bias is the fact that something that is more accessible, more easily accessible in memory will be weighted more in subsequent decision making. Okay, so something that comes to mind quickly, we think it's more important, more frequent, and we use it more in our subsequent decision making than things that are harder to remember. So of course, in recruiting and evaluation, the problem with that, so in companies, in private companies, they do annual reviews. Mathilde, I have both, so I have fish and dogs, so I'm annual reviews, right? So people that you work with on a daily basis, there is a higher likelihood that the people who did something good just before you give your review on these people will be sorry, there's questions in the chat. This distracts me, but availability bias in recruiting, it's, for instance, the last candidate you saw during an interview or a candidate that has something memorable. The last idea that was mentioned in a meeting, people will think that that's the best idea ever because that's the only one most people will remember. I have to move on because the time is very short. Your ability to meet project deadlines. Usually here the distribution is like biased. It's centered around B with a slight bias towards A, which is about what we've had here. There were lots of B's and I think slightly more A's than C's. The truth is, on average, people are terrible at meeting deadlines. I think we all know that from like when we give our paper or when we, we said the work in our house will be done by July and then they go until December. And there are tons of statistics on this in different like industries. For instance, in digital projects, we know that the average delay is 5 months. And still, engineers will tell you that their ability to meet deadlines is average, but it's not average. They're worse, right? Because nobody is actually average in meeting deadlines. So this is the overconfidence bias. So the overconfidence bias, the name is quite self-explanatory, right? So it's the fact that we have too much confidence in our own capacity. The overconfidence bias has been kind of blamed for Chernobyl and the Titanic, for instance. And I also want to mention that most people think that other people have cognitive biases, but not them. Okay, so that's a specific type of overconfidence bias called the hindsight bias. I'm going to give just 1 second now in the chat if there's any pressing comments or questions about biases. We'll have more time to discuss it later. But so Celestine is asking, in summary, what's the halo effect? In summary, the halo effect is when a positive characteristic of a person is taken into account to predict something else that is unrelated. For instance, saying somebody's tall, so I think they're going to be competent. But of course, this has nothing to do. These two things are unrelated. Kirtana is also giving an example. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Answered
So
the question.
Kirtana is summarizing the halo effect. Any other pressing questions or comments on biases before I move on? If you do, please open your mic or ask in the chat. And I'll keep going and you can ask your questions. So cognitive biases, there's a lot of them. And obviously we're not going to go into them. The reason I'm showing that is because I want to stress how important these influences are on the human brains. I'll give you a very, very quick idea of what that is by talking about decision-making for a few minutes. So as you've heard of, decision-making is, we consider that the brain has 2 types of systems. System 1, that's automatic, effortless, intuitive, and fast, and the system 2, that's rational, conscious, effortful, and slow. I do not take this as a truth, but just it's a model, right? It's just a model to think about how we think. But what I want to talk about that is interesting is that in theory, when we take very important decisions, we know that there are ways to take very important decisions rationally, right? And this is the thing that I've designed here. When we have an important decision to take, in theory, we should first define the problem, like who do I hire for this position? We should identify the criteria that matter for this. Most of the time, people don't take the time to identify the criteria because they're like, oh, I know what it means to hire, so I can just trust myself. No, you shouldn't, right? So you should identify the criteria and list them. You should think about the respective importance of each criteria. Then once you have your alternative, you should evaluate each alternative based on the criteria, right? And that should give you a number. It doesn't have to be necessarily an actual number. And then you should choose based on that. So that is what rational decision making should look like. And this is how we should take most important decisions. And as you know, this is not what we often do. Some of us do it sometimes, but most people don't do that. And certainly not always when there's an important decision to take. So since most of our daily decisions are taken in like 9 minutes or less, the beautiful pyramid that I just showed you becomes basically, it becomes this, right? So instead of going through the very rational steps, we have this big blob in our head and we try to take a rational decision, but we are actually influenced by all of these, the stress, motivation, experience, fatigue, biases, etc. So I just wanted to give a little short, sorry, again, I'm taking a little break here if somebody has comments or questions at that step. So what I wanted to say about biases that I think is not said very often, it's kind of strange that cognitive biases are now a thing that is talked about a lot, and there's like companies making money training people on cognitive biases and all the things. I just want to say that it's kind of weird that it's kind of like modern humans are suddenly realizing that there are forces that influence our decisions and forces that we can't control. And I think it's interesting because basically until Descartes and Kant, there was no doubt that humans were mostly driven by subconscious forces. So this idea that we are conscious and we just have this little glitch called cognitive biases, this is a completely wrong idea. The truth is that we're mostly irrational. If we want to be rational, we have to try really hard. And in fact, this is what Descartes and Kant found, but it was misunderstood. And so because the daily life shows us that rationality is not what defines humans, right? You see it in elections, you see it in business decisions, you see it, at work all the time. And so again, it's like, yes, there are cognitive biases, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Actually, most of our decisions are completely driven by forces that kind of are stronger than us. And so the other thing I wanted to say about that is, so why does this matter? To understand that it's not that we are mostly rational with a few cognitive biases, but it's that we are mostly irrational and sometimes we can be rational, is that first of all, if you know this, you know that you have to turn to the appropriate tools. You know that there is no magic solution. And so, for instance, and we will talk about that with Laura a little bit later, and I'm really excited to have Laura's point of view on this because I think it's very interesting. When companies say they're going to do unconscious bias training, okay, you can give a dolphin training so that the dolphin will know how to walk. You can, but it doesn't mean the dolphin will know how to walk because it doesn't have legs and it can't be out of the water, right? So I'm not saying that it's pointless, the training. I'm saying we have to know what it is. It's just a thing, kind of like the workshop I'm doing now. It's like I'm telling you things about how your brain works, which is nice, which probably some of it you already knew. But just attending a workshop on this will not change the way your brain functions. The other thing I want to say is the current backlash against D&I. I think that's interesting because it's not that there are too many diversity initiatives, and because there were too many diversity initiatives, there's a backlash. For me, it's like business as usual. In general, for now, probably at least 600 years, 700 years in Europe, society has been built on inequality. So it's kind of rare. What is rare is when there's efforts to make a society more equal and more respectful of humans. That is the rare thing. When there's a backlash like the one we saw now of a dominant class saying that they should be dominant, this is kind of business as usual, right? So we shouldn't be demoralized by the backlash, because this is what we've always fought against. If you fight for justice, for diversity, and for respect, you will always fight against the current, because the current goes against justice and diversity. So, for instance, I often talk in companies about gender fatigue, right? So gender fatigue is people are like, oh, I'm tired of hearing, oh, women, 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 they always have problems. It's like, yeah, I would love to also not have to talk about sexism. We would all love to not have to talk about it, but we have to talk about it because it's kind of woven in the fabric of society. And this is why it's hard to fight. So yeah, so that's kind of my take on cognitive biases in like a short time. So what solutions do we have? So as Miguel mentioned, the ALBA did a great work about providing members with good tools that are super clearly stated on the website. So I really encourage you guys to look. The solutions I'm going to mention here are aligned with what is on the website. Maybe some things are a bit different, but it's mostly, you have these great resources, so don't hesitate to use them. The solutions I'm going to talk about today relate to decision-making and biases. So the first one is, it's important to judge the quality of a decision by its process and not by its result. I have a million examples that come to mind, but it's so, if you take a billionaire who tells you, look, I take great decisions because I'm a billionaire, most of the time you will find out that they had a lot of money before. So it's not so much that they took the best decisions, it's that they started with a handful of aces, right? So it's very important to, I'm sure the people who are here today already know this. So because neuroscientists are probably a relatively smart crowd, but it's important to know that because something works, it doesn't mean that the thing that was done was the right thing, right? It can mean a million other things about the context. The second point that I want to suggest is to be mindful about using the rational conscious database mode, right? So obviously you don't need to run an entire AI-powered decision-making process to know whether you have to pay for your steak at the butcher. You know you have to pay for your steak, right? But sometimes when you take decisions that are high stake for yourselves or for others, then it may be worth it to actually go through the rational mode. For that, to go to the rational mode, so for using the rational mode, it's important to have objective measures. So I'm saying this from the recruiting perspective. The tool that I was selling to companies is a tool that helps companies evaluate people's talent and potential, because when they use the resume is something that some people know how to write and some people don't know how to write. So it's more like a self-selling thing, the resume. When you start using cognitive tests, at least you have an idea of people's actual potential. And of course, there's other objective measuring tools that you can use, and we can discuss this. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Another thing to do that is good is to take an exterior point of view to make sure that you're not always generating the same ideas. So crowdsourcing, it's kind of a way to avoid groupthink, right? Like when you and your friends all have the same ways to think, then you're going to end up taking always the same decisions, selecting always the same candidates, etc. Another thing that I like that is really good is to do a pre-mortem. So the idea of the pre-mortem is you went through your decision-making process. You have taken a decision. You're like, okay, for this job, I'm going to hire this candidate. You run a pre-mortem, meaning you imagine that it goes wrong with that specific candidate you took, and you try to imagine what went wrong. And by doing this, you're going to fight the kind of the positivity bias that we all have, where we're trying to convince ourselves that we took the right decision. Here, it's the other way around. You're trying to convince yourself that you took the wrong decision, and you're trying to understand why. That way, you kind of reverse your thinking, and you're going to see things that you weren't seeing before. And then, of course, another thing that I recommend, because it's also something I'm fascinated by, is nudging, using nudges, so behavioral levers to kind of push people in the right quote unquote, the right direction, right? The direction that you think is more inclusive, more fair, more just. Do you guys have any question at that point? We're going to move on to Laura. So if you have questions, you can open your mics. We have Mathilde. Are we good on time? I don't have the timing in front of my eyes. Yeah.
It's great.
Okay. So what are nudges? I'm going to tell it. Please, guys, ask questions, or you can also make comments about what you've heard. If there are things you disagree with, that's fine too. You know, if you're here today, I think it's great that you make the best out of your time. So, you know, really, please don't be shy. Ask questions, open your mic, ask questions in the chat. Okay, so please let us prevent the US practices of eliminating from drifting over here. What's going on is no say. Oops, I can't see. What's going on now under Trump is not just going back to the way it has been, it is much worse. And yes. Karine, yes, of course. Yes. I wasn't talking about the general policy. I was talking only about the DEI initiative. Obviously, this is not the place for a much larger political debate, and I agree with you. Can I give example of nudge to push people towards fair recruitment decision making? Yes, I will. Yes, we will give examples also during the discussion with Laura. Small incentives can make a big difference, but it depends very much on the context. Yes. Edith, I agree with you. If you want to develop on that later, that would be very interesting. As well as considering the process, should we also look at the final results? Yeah, so I'm reading everything. I'm responding to the easy questions, and the more complex things we can keep for the discussion. Celestine is asking concerning the solutions. Do I think that using a resume is not an effective tool? Yes, using the resume is not an effective tool at all. The resume has, when you run studies on the effectiveness of the resume, the precision of the resume is 20%. The way this is measured is you take a bunch of resumes, you select the people based on the resumes, you invite them to interviews, you run the interviews, and you see how many candidates actually have the skills for the job that you posted. And it's actually 20%. So when you do a selection only based on the resume, the candidates you invite, 80% of them don't have the skills. So the resume is a terrible tool. And this probability becomes higher if you add technical tests, case studies, cognitive tests, structured interviews. They increasingly become better, and then you get a bunch of candidates that are actually selected properly. But yeah, the resume is a terrible tool. The resume is something that was invented by Léonard de Vinci for a complete different purpose. And it's unfortunate that it still is the thing that is used in the industry, but that's what it is. Sometimes positive action is necessary, especially if the pool of candidates is not diverse to start with. Yes, I agree. So for me, the best alternative to the resume is basically, I think there's no better way to know if somebody will be good at a job than having that person do the job. So for instance, if you're hiring a postdoc, I think the best way to know whether that postdoc is the right postdoc for you is you should have like a case study like they do in consulting, which means you tell them, okay, let's say I hire you and we have funding for 2 years. You know what work is done in my lab. What would be the 3 top topics you would want to work on? And give me a description of how you would go about addressing these questions. And then you have them present it to you. I think there is no better way to evaluate somebody's ability to do a job than that person doing the job. The problem with that is that it's what takes the longest time. So if you have 150 candidates, you're not going to do that with 150 candidates. You need a pre-selection tool. The pre-selection tools, for me, the best pre-selection tools are technical tests and cognitive tests. And you can buy them or you can make them yourself. It's not that complicated to create or to purchase. If you're interested in discussing that further, feel free to contact me after the workshop. There are tons of evaluation tools on the market. It depends also on the budget that you can put in, or sometimes you can make your own custom tools. But it's good to evaluate people's ability to technically do the job that you need. Also, just to be clear, I'm not saying that subjectivity should not have a part in selection, because you're selecting somebody you're going to work with or is going to be your colleague or whatever. So it's good to feel whether you want to work with that person. But I'm saying it should not be the first and only step for the selection. And somebody says unconscious biases is not that well known outside our crowd. Many people, including faculty in my institute, don't know they have it. Yes, so this is a good point. This is the hindsight bias, right? So one of the largest bias is that people think that they don't have biases. This is why, again, since Descartes and Kant, this is the philosophical, the thing that everybody agrees on since Descartes and Kant is that we are rational human beings. That fake belief about rationality is maintained because it feeds with the current economical system. Like trickle-down economics is something that was invented to fit with the model of rational agent in the economical theory. So obviously, when you tell people, look, you guys don't know that your decisions are biased, it's hard for them to believe because this is not the most common belief. This is not what they've been told since they're children. They've been told the opposite. So it's hard to fight this. Yes, it is impossible for people to accept there are six racist explaining. Yeah, Edith, it is difficult for people to accept they are sexist or racist. Explaining that it is unconscious or societal is extremely important. Yeah. Assuming there are thousands of people, how would you pre-select them before giving them? Yes. So this is what I was saying. If you have a lot of people to pre-select from, you need to use automatized tools. So you can create your own questionnaires, or you can use cognitive tests that exist on the market. Again, please feel free to contact me if you want examples of tools, because it's very dependent on your budget and your specific use case. Is providing a standardized resume template for candidates to feel more effectively is minimizing variation in format and content. So yeah, a standardized resume template, it looks like it could be a good idea on paper, but the problem is that it's not that much better because, again, some people know how to formulate a way to talk about themselves that is very selling, and some other people are not that good at selling themselves. So in my mind, it doesn't necessarily really protect from the biases. I hope that what I said about the tools is clear enough. We need to remember companies use AI and automated methods to screen candidates, make the intervention complex. AI, yeah. So companies that use AI for resume screening, it is used, but not as much as we would think, because there's been so many scandals. So my company was using AI to make our test better, and that was making people freak out usually. So companies are not that keen on using AI. A little bit for resume screening, because you can do some of the resume screening if you just extract words. What was wrong with the Amazon AI selection is that it was not just extracting keywords, it was actually making the selection. Okay, I know how we're doing on time. Maybe we need to move on to the discussion. Mathilde, what do you think?
Yes, that would be good.
Okay, so let's have our conversation. Maybe I missed some questions, but we can go back to them later, okay? Okay, cool. So Laura, I have a little slide here to present you. So we're going to have a discussion with Laura because she has done a lot of very interesting things in resume, committee selection, and she also may talk to us about some personal experience she wants to share. So Laura, you're professor of developmental neuroscience at King's College London. You're the group leader at Center for Developmental Neurobiology. You've done a lot of work with ALBA, and you actually were in the first founder of the declaration, if I understand well. You'll tell us.
I was in the team.
You were in the team, yeah, but you were at the beginning, so that's cool. You were in the SFN Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. You co-created the British Neuroscience Association Scholar Program, and you won the Louis Anson Marshall Special Recognition Award. Hello, Laura, how are you doing?
Very good, thanks.
Okay, so you have done a lot of work on different aspects, or I'm pulling out my notes here, regarding diversity. Sorry, I have too many things on my window and I need to open my notes. Sorry, guys, 1 second. Voila, up. So you told me you had operated both in recruitment, trying to make conferences and panels more inclusive, and you also have a personal experience with disability. So is there one of these topics you want to start with?
No, I'm very relaxed. Unless people have a preference, they can shout.
So let's start with recruiting then, because I want to start with recruiting. I just was asking just in case. Is there something in So I think it would be interesting to know where you're coming from in, like, what made you be interested in this topic? And I was wondering if there's a moment in your career that made you feel or made you aware of that issue and that made you start working in the issues. There's something you would like to share about this, about why you got interested in the issues.
So I guess it was a slow thing. I think if I'm honest, you know, I was previously a medic, and when I was a junior doctor, I didn't really feel that you know, there were big issues. Maybe, you know, I just missed it. But it was more as I came into academia that I started noticing, you know, just little things. Very few women at that time in my field. Little things like if you said something, people would then credit it to someone else who was male, and I would be like, wait a minute. But I think the thing that I kind of be familiar. The thing that really made me want to do something more dramatic was when I was running this PhD program, and I, you know, if I'm honest, I wanted to find out what our statistics on diversity were, really because we were applying for a renewal of the program, and I knew that this would be something that would be looked at by the panel in the UK. So I think this is an example of where, you know, funding bodies simply saying, you know, this is something we will consider actually does have an impact. And so, you know, it was nothing particularly noble. I was just kind of thought, well, you know, I better do this. So that made me then try and get the data for the program that I've been running, which, you know, that immediately threw up a bunch of interesting things, which was that, one, it was quite hard to get hold of. Two, actually, there was quite limited data. So they'd only collected data on, you know, gender, disability, and ethnicity. That was it. And of course, there are many other axes of diversity. So that was also interesting. And then when I kind of ran the numbers, I then realized that, of course, my program was, you know, not diverse. We were pretty representative in terms of gender and actually disability, but we were very, very poorly representative in terms of ethnicity in the UK. And basically that was what inspired me to try and create this scholars program with the British Neuroscience Association, was to specifically target what I saw as a very obvious issue, that being made to look at the data had really kind of brought home to me and made me think about what the potential reasons for that was and whether there was anything that I personally could do about it. And I think often we think, well, there's not much I can do, but I guess, you know, I kind of increasingly realize that there's more you can do than you think. So that has been quite interesting.
So I think it's interesting. So there's like 3 things that I think are really interesting. First, that it's when you arrived in academia that that it became clear to you that there was a problem with diversity. I imagine it's not so much because academia is less diverse than other areas, but it's because you suddenly had that role about designing the program. And so you, maybe prior to that, maybe you had different types of roles where you were more focused on what you were doing in your context, and then suddenly you have to think for others. And that drives you into thinking about what happens when you're thinking for the group, right? I also like the fact that talking about regulations, because this is a very clear example of someone who you probably were sympathetic to the idea of diversity, but what helped you really get into it was the fact that there was a regulation. And I think this is very important that people remember that when we talk about regulations, it's not that we think that there's like bad people that need regulation to do the right thing. Is that regulations help everybody because it's the way to think about society, right? So that kind of goes against what is usually said, I think, in a lot of contexts. The third thing I want to say about what you shared is about data. It's very interesting. So something we say in diversity is that only the things that you count. So if you and so it's interesting to know what is it that we're going to measure, right? So for instance, if you want to measure for social diversity, it's not that easy because, you know, yeah, you can ask people their parents' income, or you can ask where they're from. I mean, it becomes hard to know exactly what you want to measure. And in my mind, it's these conversations that are interesting, is to think about what you want to measure and for what aim. So that's very interesting. Is that when you did the unconscious bias training was when?
So that was a bit before then. So I'm based at King's College London, and at a certain point, King's basically decided that anyone who was going to sit on any interview panel should undergo unconscious bias training. And so this was actually just as I had become a junior PI, and obviously was now going to be sitting on panels, having previously, you know, not really done very much of that. And so I kind of dragged myself off to this mandatory unconscious bias training. And I admit, you know, really thinking, oh God, you know, I don't have very much time. Another kind of, you know, I've got to give off a whole day to this mandatory, you know, boring thing I need to do. And I have to say, and I know unconscious bias training is a bit controversial. And I think possibly, I mean, as you rightly say, one is that, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make it drink. So, you know, it's not going to transform the way you think. But also, I think it very much depends on who does it. And I had someone who was amazing. And it was, I mean, I can tell you the entire group that I was in, we all just sort of sat there kind of open mouthed by the end, kind of going, oh my God, this is such a huge thing. And we all have this. And we don't need to feel guilty about it. We just need to recognize it and think about it and think about how we can kind of combat it. So I personally found that very eye-opening and helpful. And I think all credit to my institution that they sort of decided to implement this. Again, this was something, you know, this wasn't, you know, me thinking this would be a great thing. This was someone at King's, you know, maybe we have these champions for diversity had said, you know, this is something we should do. So I think it is a good thing, even though, you know, it is going to depend quite a lot on the specific training you get, and then, you know, how often, and, you know, you can think about it a lot for, you know, maybe a few weeks, and then, you know, maybe you're busy and you know, time is short, and you just go back to the usual way of kind of thinking about recruitment.
But I guess the idea, so there's several things that are super interesting in what you're saying. So first of all, who was that person?
She was a woman. She was very impressive. So she was a Black British woman who had been adopted and had grown up in a very wealthy white suburb of London, and so had this very interesting perspective in that she'd gone to a school where there were no other Black kids, there were no Black teachers, you know, she'd gone to university, no Black professors, and and actually had gone through her own little kind of road to Damascus moment where someone had talked to her about unconscious bias, and she's like, well, don't be ridiculous. You know, I'm a Black woman. I don't have any unconscious biases. And of course you do. You've been brought up in this environment. And she went to interview someone to kind of debunk this idea, and came away completely convinced that it was real, and ended up switching to do training. And so she was just very compelling, and she made us, you know, she was very good at, a bit like those kind of little snapshots you did at the beginning, but, you know, much longer. She was very good at revealing to everyone their own biases, which obviously is quite impactful, because you know, you're then shocked into kind of realization. So yeah, it was very effective.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is very cool also because it gives me a chance to yes. Did you take down the slide, Mathilde? Yes. Yeah, it gives me just a chance to say several things. So one is, I find it super important to separate, when we talk about biases, I find it very important to separate the person who may be the victim, quote unquote, of biases, and the person who is talking as an expert about a topic, right? So for instance, so I was invited to panels to talk about gender diversity. I was invited because I'm a woman, and I'm like, guys, I don't think I'm relevant talking about biases because I'm a woman. I think I'm relevant talking about this because I actually studied this, right? Maybe I studied this for, 20 years because I'm a woman, and so I find it's very interesting in the example you give that the reason this person was very good is not because she was a Black woman. It's because it so happens that being a Black woman, she was like, well, whatever, unconscious biases, I don't have any. And then she discovered it, and then she became an expert, right? And I feel like sometimes on panels and discussions, it's confusion, right? You can totally invite a woman to talk about gender who is completely sexist. It's the fact that you're a woman doesn't make you non-sexist. And you can invite a Black 50-year-old male who's like a super hardcore feminist who's going to say very interesting things. So I always find it important to point out because I feel like it's sometimes confused. And about what you shared, I also wanted to say, you're very nice to say she was amazing, but maybe I was also thinking unconscious bias training works also depending on who takes the training. So maybe your group had something special that maybe you were interested in this. And as you say, the institution was supportive, right? So so there's kind of two things for me. It's like, maybe like what made you guys receptive to that training, and also something else that kind of perspires through your experience is that it was an interesting thing, right? Even though
I think it was, it was fascinating. I would say that there was nothing very special about that group. I mean, it was a pretty random selection of people, I would say none of whom were going enthusiastically.
Yeah.
So, and everybody came out going, oh, wow, that was actually really, really useful and really good. So I think it was just that it was, I think she was great and was just very effective at revealing to us, this phenomenon and how powerful it was.
Yeah. So let's move on to some practical cases that we feel would probably be useful for people who are here. So we talked about the unconscious bias training. So in the programs that you have put together, maybe what about talking about the BNA Scholar program? Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so that was, as I said, that was really to try and tackle this problem of lack of representation for certain ethnic groups in neuroscience, and particularly in kind of my PhD program. And I did quite a lot of kind of reading and research about this, and kind of, it was during COVID, so I kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole. And one of the things I noticed was that we had very, very few applicants for the program from certain ethnic groups. And in fact, these groups are just consistently not represented throughout academia. So for example, I actually did some hunting around the UKRI data, which they helpfully put online, but then they less helpfully don't actually draw attention to anything. But it transpired that, for example, if you look at lead PIs on all grants over the then previous 10 years from UKRI. So that's all of kind of research, big research grants. The percentage of people from Black, Bangladeshi or Pakistani groups was 0% for all of them, 0. So what it made me realize is that there's, you know, there's a major lack of role models at universities, because these are the people who would be getting these grants, who would be teaching undergraduates. And there's also this thing called the attainment gap at universities, where people from certain ethnic groups come in with exactly the same A-level scores. So they basically, the entry requirements, they've done just as well. And then they just do worse at the end. So they exit with a lower graduation mark, which means that they're then not ever going to be eligible for PhD programs, just because of the way that the, you know, all the criteria work. So so we basically tried to set up a network. It's basically, the idea was completely stolen from the Society of Neurosciences, which does this, but targeting this specific group of underrepresented ethnic groups in the UK, and providing basically networking possibilities, dedicated mentorship, and sort of opportunities to kind of basically just a few other things, which ideally, hopefully, money to attend conferences, you know, which again are good for network building, to give people just a little bit of extra help, because it's very competitive in academia anyway, but that will hopefully allow at least a few people to kind of make it all the way through to eventually become those role models, maybe provide mentorship themselves, etc. So so that was basically what we did. We fundraised, you know, got this scheme together, and it's been running now for a few years. And you know, in the US, a similar scheme has run for 25 years, run out of SFN, and that's been incredibly effective and has really changed the landscape. Many of the people who are now very senior faculty from underrepresented groups came through that program. So so you know, these kind of programs have been shown to be quite effective.
And is it something that you feel people were very receptive, that in general, people who are kind of against diversity solutions, they would say, well, you know, if these students are good enough, they should be able to get in by themselves. Why do they need help, right? I imagine did you face some of that, or
no, I did. Well, no, I didn't face any, you know, direct criticism like that. What I came up against was just people not getting back to me, and you know, when we were fundraising, and you know, people kind of go, oh yes, sounds great, but you know, we don't really have the ability to give you any actual help right now. So it was more kind of, yeah, I can't really be bothered. But I think what helped, and I guess this comes back to what we're talking about, some of the things with the declaration, was that you know, evidence was very powerful. So you know, digging up that data from the UKRI, which they had collected and posted, very helpful, was, you know, something that you can kind of go, look, you know, no one can look at this and think that this is fair. You know, there's a problem. You know, the data that had been collected by people who'd studied the attainment gap, again, you know, you're looking at a group that has the same entry level scores. So, you know, it's not that they didn't, you know, weren't as good when they got into university, but they are not doing as well. What is going on? What is the reason for that? And again, that kind of data was quite compelling to say, look, there's a very specific issue here. People are not fulfilling their potential. And, you know, we want to make it fair. We're not trying to give people like an extra leg up that, you know, they don't need. It's very much about, making things fairer and trying to work out what's gone wrong.
Do you have any advice for people who would want to like start a program like this? I mean, you've already said quite a lot, but if you have some advice for people in the crowd who would be interested in launching this kind of program.
Well, I think probably the key is to get help, and to identify, you know, maybe an organization that can, you know, give you some support. So in my case, I basically had this idea and thought, you know, who would be best to approach. And at that point, I thought that the society, the country-based society would for neuroscience would be the right people. And I mean, but then literally I Googled, you know, president of the BNA. I mean, I wasn't actually involved with the BNA at that time, found her email address and sent her an email.
Okay.
So, you know, you don't need to, you could be anybody and you could do that. And I got an immediate I mean, that's the thing, is that, you know, people have to be willing to help and think this is a good idea, but they were very supportive. You know, I wrote to the Wellcome Trust, and there was lots, you know, who constantly talking about how important diversity is, and I think they genuinely wanted to help, but they were just, their way the organization works, they were sort of tied in knots. They couldn't actually organize to do anything. Same with UKLI. So you know, for me, the British Neuroscience Association were the people who were kind of flexible enough and motivated enough to help, and then it sort of went on from there.
Yeah, so it's good because it shows that it's good to keep people to what they say, right? You have organizations that say this is important, and you're like, okay, well then let's do something. So sometimes simple things can help. Miguel had his hand raised. Do you want to say something?
I was tempted to add something, but it might be best left until later. Not sure. I was just going to come in and agree with Laura on the importance of those kinds of data that she was mentioning, because a huge bias that we have in our community is that we think of ourselves as scientists, and therefore we say things like, "Oh, we're data driven. I'll believe it when I see the data," and things like that. And when you actually do see the data, it's actually, even in a country that thinks of itself as being enlightened, like the UK, you know, it's actually those data on attainment gaps or achievement gaps are really striking, and they show things that, like, for example, actually the Black students that do the best at A levels are the ones that are most hurt, you know, relatively speaking, by these gaps. So those explanations that most people would come up with, saying, "Oh, it's just social class, you know, it's just that they did worse," or they, you know, the ones that did worse then fall more behind because they had worse skills in school, because they were taught at worse neighborhoods. Actually, that completely falls down once you actually look at the data.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think often what goes against doing the right thing is breaking the thermometer. You know, it's like one way to maintain social injustice is to just not take the temperature and not collect the data. So this is a very good point. When we have data, to use them and try to collect more. And I want to just move on to the next question because it's related, Laura, to everybody, if you guys want to ask questions to Laura, you can ask them in the chat. And Laura, I want to ask you that question. So Mathilde is saying, and it's related to something else I want to ask. So could you comment on the fact that the definition of scientific excellence might also hurt the progress of underrepresented scientists in their career? Should we reconsider the way we evaluate students and colleagues? And how can we think of a fairer system? And maybe this can be related to what you've done with conferences and panels, if that makes sense to you to comment via this.
Yeah, I think they're different things. And I'm not sure that there is a definition of scientific excellence. And I suspect it changes depending on career stage and, you know, where you are, and lots of different, it's very contextual. I think I basically think it would be like, it would be great if we could say, you know, let's rethink this. And I do think that people are trying to do that. You know, sort of a good example would be the fact that at least at the more senior level, you're judged on your publications, but we all know that these biases kick in all the way through. So, you know, if you're a woman, you're much less likely to get your papers published in the high impact journals. You know, that there's all sorts of, there's plenty of evidence of bias of reviewers and editors, and, you know, the whole thing. So, you know, so then you know, but the answer, of course, is then difficult, right? It's a bit like we're talking about, you know, resumes. Resume is bad, but then, you know, it'd be great if we could interview everyone. We can't interview thousands of people. It's just not going to be possible. You know, publications shouldn't be used as a shorthand for, you know, excellence. But on the other hand, what you really should do is, you know, talk to people and talk about their scientific ideas and understand, you know, what they've done. But that takes an incredible amount of time and effort. So I think these things are definitely things to think about, but we do also have to be realistic about, you know, how we can go about changing that in a way that isn't just going to sort of be unworkable, and then that won't be helpful. I think at the PhD level, you know, we have, you know, there are metrics. So, you know, you have to get in the UK, you have to get a 2-1 or a first in order to be allowed to do a PhD. If you don't, you can go off and do a master's, but then you have to get a merit distinction. And these are used as proxies, but I think that is just, you know, that's kind of the nature of the beast. I suspect that we're probably better off trying to tackle the problems to do with not achieving that 2-1 or first class at university, which are related to things like lack of role models, lack of feeling that you belong at university, often financial issues. So often these groups are actually doing 1 or even 2 jobs on the side. That's going to affect their studies. You know, there are a whole bunch of things. So identifying what those are, I think at that level, probably it makes more sense to focus on solving those rather than trying to redesign the whole thing.
Yeah. So it's clear to everybody who's paying attention that lack of diversity is linked to social injustice in a systemic way. So I want to refocus on something else you did because in terms of concrete, like, okay, not fighting the system, but finding a specific thing to make things fair. So the question is, what did you do? So you worked on gender equality for seminar speakers and ensure diversity at SFN, right? Do you want to talk about some of these programs and so to help have an idea of what could work?
So at SFN, it was very interesting. So there were sort of 2 aspects. So one was I worked quite hard on trying to improve diversity of the symposia. So, you know, SFN is huge. So they have the top of the slate, which was what they call the kind of the big plenary speakers. And then there's all the big kind of symposia, mini symposia, and then posters is sort of everybody. And so for the symposia, mini symposia, we actually drew up guidelines. So we created, first of all, we started collecting data. So again, that was something they weren't doing. So, you know, it was we need to know. Then we kind of changed the guidelines saying, you know, diversity will be one of the criteria by which your, you know, proposal will be judged. Please explain how because we realized there were so many different axes. Obviously, these symposia need to be scientifically coherent as well. You know, you can't ask it for the world. So we gave people kind of, you know, free text to just explain that they thought about it and that this is what, you know, this is how their proposal also had taken this into account, and made it clear that that would be part of the criteria on the basis of which they assess. So that was on one thing, and I think that has definitely helped. So having seen the change in the symposia there's been no drop off in scientific excellence, but they are much more diverse than they used to be. Again, just making people think about it. It's like being on the other side of what happened to me. For the top of the slate, that was interesting. So again, that was to do with, I realized that in order to have a diverse top of the slate, you have to nominate the candidates. So that's just the way that it's always worked. And if you don't nominate them, then they can't be considered. So I just made a personal point of just nominating as many diverse potential speakers as possible, so that then when we got to the actual decision-making time, there were lots and lots of potential candidates. And what I will say is that, and I think this happens, it's true for SFN, it's true actually for all the conferences that I've been involved in, which is that what you quite often have is little separate groups that go off and, you know, make their decision. And in your little separate group, you know, you can think, oh, you know, so-and-so would be absolutely our top speaker for this particular topic because they've just published a cool paper that's really relevant, everyone will be interested in. And then when you all get back together again, you realize that, you know, 100% of your speakers are old white men, right? So, and each individual decision was perfectly reasonable, but when you put the whole thing together, you know, that's not going to be great for everybody looking at that and thinking, okay, well, you know, where's the state of, you know, all the, you know, the top of the field at the moment? And that's where having a chair who kind of looks at the whole thing and kind of goes, okay, guys, you know, this is not okay. We need to go back to the drawing board. And SFN do that. So I think that's been very helpful in making sure that, you know, not only are you bearing this in mind, but also everyone is ready to revisit their decisions and discuss it across the broader picture. Yeah, so I think that's also been fascinating to be on the inside of that. And I think if you look at the top of the slate at SFN for the last couple of years, it's, you know, it's not bad.
Yeah, I think it's also good to remember that when you work on diversity and justice, it's like it creates like a healthier system and it's better for everybody, right? So it's like, you know, saying that this small group of people deciding for everybody is not a good idea. Yeah, it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea for anybody. We have to move on to the next session. Thank you so much, Laura. I would like to tell you guys, if you have questions for Laura, please either ask them in the chat, or we're going to move on now to breakout sessions. Thank you so much, Laura. She will be, so let me explain to you how the breakout session is going to work, but there is like a question. Okay, I'll read the questions in the chat in a minute. Let me just pull out for 1 second the presentation to explain what we're doing now. Okay, so we're gonna do some group work. A workshop. So the idea is now we're gonna split you guys in groups, breakout rooms. You're going to have 20 minutes. You will have in each of the rooms, there's going to be one of us to kind of help moderate the session. The idea is that we would like you to get the opportunity to work on one problem per group. So all the participants in the breakout group can say, oh, I have this question or this problem or whatever. The group chooses one problem, question, or issue that you're going to work on together. You will brainstorm together, and one of us will be with you to make sure that we use kind of the best practices that ALBA has been pushing and that we've been discussing today. And then we will all rejoin in the plenary. You don't have anything to do to go to the rooms and all that. This will all be done automatically. So we're handling this. You will just receive at some point a message that says that you're moving to another room. I think everybody's back. Let me see. Is everybody back? Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, no, not everybody yet. Mathilde, what do you think? Should we start? Just so we have time to, yeah, we should start, right? It's 10:02. Let's start the restitution. Do you guys want, maybe Laura's group, can you start? Your restitution? What did you work on, and what solutions did you find?
That's Violetta.
Okay, yes. So we worked on how to, after creating these narrative CVs, see how to evaluate candidates without biases. So we discuss actually, even after we write this very long 50 pages narrative of our lives, and what we have done is how to make it in a way that is better evaluated by selection committee. So first of all, we thought, because some of us are already on evaluation committees, that we have to have guidelines for assessing various criteria. Is to understand the different significance and how we can contribute to science differently. Okay, we have publications, but also, are you involved in open science, communal servers, communication, original idea? So we thought that maybe the selection committee or even the institution that is asking for a new candidate has to be more proactive in defining the person they want. So at least the selection committee can have, more precise idea on what they're asking from the candidate, how the candidate is going to be evaluated. So have a table of weight and scores for each one of these. So what is your communal service? What is your publication? What are your originality and original ideas you're bringing to the institution, something like that. And then this has to be communicated to the candidate. So they already know how to maybe make not a very big narrative, but to correspond and see how do they fit to these questions. I think it's going to be more unbiased, because also we propose to not write an evaluation, but give scores for each candidate. So at the end, we are not trying to overinterpret what every member of the jury is trying to say while he's writing things, but really, this is the score I give him for originality and so on. And hopefully with that, at least we realize we have to do more work in defining beforehand the position. So it's easier for the committee, because they build it together, to really evaluate fairly the candidates.
Yeah. So just a quick comment. This for me, this is the most important thing when we select people is, as you said, is to make sure about what criteria we have. And then just, as you said, collecting data in the most objective way. So having like a questionnaire or something. Also understanding that when we try to make it more fair, it's never going to be perfect, and that's fine. What we try to achieve is better, right? So when I was telling you the resume is 20% precision, our tool was 80% precision. It's not 100%, but it's so much better. And the last point is the way the committee discusses the results. So if you have scoring, it's good. The other thing is when you do an interview of the candidate, you can also use structured interview with like points that you can then, if there's like 5 committee members, you can be like, okay, point number 1, we wanted to know the candidate is proactive. What do you think about whether they're proactive? Because you have a structured interview guideline with specific questions that are always asked the same to every candidate.
Yeah. So establish evaluation criteria and adhere to them, and ask all applicants similar questions. Spend each equal time. So all these things that needs to be. I think we need to spend more time defining how we run these interviews, and that we have more structure in it. And like Laura said, to really have like a concise, guidelines of what the institution is expecting for this as well. Because sometimes they're not very clear, they just want a new team leader or new faculty members, but if they are more precise, in what they're looking for, then for us as a selection committee, it's easier to put, this weight on these things and hopefully make it less biased.
That's very good. Sorry, I just want to keep time for the other groups, but we could talk about that longer. But just,
and just a thing I would like to share, because this is a YouTube video that we share with our selection committee at the Paris Brain Institute, is it's really well done. It's from Spain. It's an institute in Spain that explains all the biases that can occur during a selection process. So if you haven't seen it, it's very well done. And we make all of our selection committee watch it before they do. So if you're interested to look at it.
Thank you very much. Very good. Should we move to I was thinking maybe Miguel's group?
Yeah, that was me reporting. So we were looking at kind of this difficulty of selecting candidates from diverse backgrounds when there's this prevalent concept of excellence, and also how to kind of raise awareness in committees that are usually composed of people who come from privileged backgrounds. So we thought of 3 different things. So one of them is blinding the selection process to try and reduce bias, and there are pros and cons to this. Because to some extent, masking a lot of information can also mask the context in which people are, doing their research, and that having that context is important to understand, their output and therefore how excellent they are considered. So then what we thought was, like Camille, you suggested, is to really look at the process, and like Violeta was just talking about, have it clear who you want to select, and then decide at which stages of the selection process is relevant to mask what pieces of information, to consider what biases kick in when. The other thing is, so to explicitly provide context of where and under which conditions a candidate is doing research. So that can really kind of also unmask the unconscious bias that is influencing the decision making. And if we have kind of more consciously present, the different bias that might also improve the quality of the selection process. And there was also a comment on the importance of explaining why it's even important to strive for diversity within excellence. So rather than putting this kind of poorly undefined concept of excellence before anything else or any other criteria, is to consider that maybe we need community excellence rather than individual excellence, and that very diverse research teams actually improve excellent research outputs. And then Karin Holm highlighted that there's been an opinion piece on the impact of diversity in research, and this might be available on the ALBA website. So we thought, it could be good for this group.
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you. I just this gives me the opportunity to highlight the idea of when we take a decision, what are we optimizing for? So this is a really good point when you're saying, are we optimizing for individual excellence or for group excellence or for whatever else. And this is for me, when just as before we said, sometimes we don't define the criteria well enough. And I think most of the time we don't really try to understand what we're optimizing for. So this is a really good point. Yeah, we're gonna have time. Let's move on to whose group, Mathilde or Katana? Sorry, we were supposed to finish in 3 minutes at 5. So either we give you the wrap up now in like 1 minute, or we hear the 2 other groups. I would be in favor of hearing the 2 other groups. We may run a few minutes late. Are you guys okay with that? You can do yay or whatever. Okay, let's do that.
Yay.
I want to hear what
Well,
you guys found.
Maybe Christina, you can go. Or Joanna, you want to talk, or it's difficult?
I can do it. I'm sorry, I just had to travel to a place, so now
Okay.
you see me moving my car.
No worries.
Well, we discussed about several issues on selection, different things like selecting students or speakers or leaders or people for grants and different opportunities. And I think that a very interesting point that popped out in our group was that sometimes the solution becomes part of the problem because it reflects our own bias instead of challenging the bias. One of the colleagues was saying, like, I applied for this grant and that was targeted at, fighting inequality, and turns out I was the only one that was selected like me. So it actually did not help much. And in the solutions we found, because I'm sorry, I do these very quick. I just know that we're running late. But yeah, we discussed the importance of using more appropriate selection tools, but also using affirmative actions so we can analyze the population and maybe invite or select more diverse criteria or diverse people for speakers or participating by identifying the issue so we can target it appropriately. And to do this, maybe help provide more visibility for diversity.
I think there's something I didn't hear very well at the very beginning. Sorry. There's something before you said, oh, I have to go really fast. I don't know whether it's just you or someone from your group can just say that again, because I missed it.
Yeah,
Also,
sorry, my
no,
internet.
no, it's maybe somebody from your group can reformulate.
No, we were saying that we have seen several issues in selection for different things, for labs, for speakers, for opportunities. And we saw that sometimes the solutions that are proposed to target inequality tend to be more a more clear reflection of our bias instead of actually challenging the bias. So you create an opportunity, let's say for a specific ethnic group or a specific background to support, and then it becomes a problem because it just reflects that you have a bias towards that group instead of actually giving them the support they need. Yeah,
that's a very good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. I don't have something smarter to say to that, but I agree that. So I think just one thing I want to say about this is that the fact that the problem is complex doesn't mean that it's a bad problem to address, right? It's just, I think there are some problems in life that are here so that we keep trying to address them, and we know there's no perfect solution, but what matters is that we try to get together to think about this, because on the way of thinking for solutions, we may come across little solutions for smaller problems as well. Should we, thank you very much. Should we move on to Kirtana's group then? Or did you guys want to add something for that group?
Sure, I can, either Dory, do you want to summarize quickly? Do you want me to?
Yeah, no, I can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we also focused on this idea of scientific excellence, specifically in the context of selecting candidates and sort of broadening that out to what are we actually wanting to select for. So Teresa brought this really interesting case where they're hiring for their institute in Mexico and are looking for people specifically with more adaptability and those kinds of soft skills. And so then the question is, how do you evaluate people on whether they're able to do that? And the current sort of way of doing that through interviews and inviting them for a day doesn't seem to be enough. One option, or one thing that was mentioned, that Karthana mentioned at the very end, but was, I think, really important and was highlighted just in the previous groups as well, is that there needs to be an idea of what soft skills are actually needed. So it's important for either the lab or the selection committee or whoever's doing the selecting to know what kind of soft skills specifically are we looking for. Then one option that was raised was to look for community work, either in the resume or ask them to elaborate on this specifically. So often in work that is not specifically, their publications, you can maybe see some of the soft skills coming more towards the foreground. So some examples were doing volunteering work, going above and beyond in teaching. And this is often not found standard on resumes, or people even leave it out. So maybe emphasizing that. And the other way, or another really good point, which is slightly less on selecting, but more on attracting more diverse candidates, is to make sure that it's explicitly stated what sort of resources they might get when they go into the institute. So if for example, resources are listed, I'm thinking about my own institute. We have a baby room, and we have a like several sort of child-related sort of accommodations, and so having that listed in an application might also make the position more attractive to women with children or anyone with children, and they might then be more likely to apply. So that could also be a way to kind of address some of the self-selecting bias already. Yeah, I think those were some of the main things. One other thing we talked about was sort of being aware of people's background and being aware that that maybe their background, where they're coming from, will influence, right, what their publication level is, or what their CV looks like. And then it might be more important to ask them to like explain their publications, or say like, what's your favorite one and why is this important to you?
Yeah, so it just gives me the opportunity to highlight 2 points that you guys have talked about. It's making positions attractive is like super important, and in the private world, this is called employer branding, right? Like making sure that you attract enough people. And again, the idea that when we address diversity, we address a whole lot of topics, including how happy people are going to be at work, and also because it's a dialogue between the recruiter and the future employee. I think it should be seen as a dialogue as soon as the selection process starts, right? It's a bit too late to tell people once they're in the institute, oh, by the way, we don't have that resource that we were suggesting. And then the other thing you mentioned briefly, but I want to highlight it again, it's that concept of soft skills. When you hire candidates, you want them to have certain set of hard skills, but also soft skills like being able to adapt to the new position, being able to work collaboratively with the team. This is something we touched upon, but we maybe didn't talk about it again. Thank you guys very much. We do just a few minutes of wrap up. We will be done by 5:10. Thank you so much for staying until now. And thank you for your active participation. That was amazing. Honestly, this is probably one of the most friendly crowds I've worked with. So thank you for being so well intentioned. I just want to show you one last thing, and then Mathilde will show you. So there is a link to the resume, to the survey. There's a link to the survey in the chat, the like post-workshop survey. If you guys could please click on this. I'm sure we will send you an email with that survey link again, but please click on this and fill in the survey. It's important for ALBA and for IBRO. I also want to mention real quick that when preparing this workshop with ALBA, I suggested that maybe it's a bit frustrating to do this in only 2 hours. And I wanted to know, and we're asking that in the survey, if you guys could tell us if you would be interested in a longer workshop, like a day workshop, potentially in person, So we're seeing whether that would be possible to organize. That would be amazing, but we need budget for this. So we need to make sure we have people interested. We need to find a budget for this. So it's listed in the survey. So please tell us if you would be interested in that, because you see, we had to cram a lot of content in 2 hours. If we do this over one day, we have time to talk about biases. We have time to talk about like the philosophy of it. We have time to talk about your problems in a much more deep way. So if we find the resources, we would love to do this. So let us know if you would be interested. And Mathilde, do you want to share something before we?
Just a reminder that we have 2 more workshops in the series. So the second one is going to be about changing the academic culture and the cultures in the lab and being more inclusive that way. And then the last one is going to be how do we really embed EDI, so diversity, into the DNA of our programs, so that it's not like an add-on, but something that's like there from the beginning. So that's the 2 workshops. Sorry, I'm sharing this very quickly, so it's not very professional. And then please scan this QR code. Please, please, please take 5 minutes to fill in the survey. It's really helping us to know what you like, what you didn't like, and how can we improve this. So, and thanks a lot for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Mathilde, for the organization, and Cortana. Thank you guys for participating. We hope you're gonna, get in touch, tell us what you think. We didn't address all the questions that were in the chat, so don't hesitate to ask them by email or, and then I don't know, Mathilde, I guess since this is there will be more workshops in the future, you can probably continue the conversation if needed on things that
Absolutely.
showed up. Yeah. Thank you guys very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great.
Be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.